There is a specific kind of silence that follows a man who kills for a living. It's heavy, cold. It clears rooms and empties hallways. For 10 years, Victor walked inside that silence, untouchable and utterly alone. He liked it that way. Until a Tuesday morning at 8:14 a.m. The elevator doors were sliding shut, sealing him in his quiet world, when a scuffed white sneaker shoved between the metal plates. The doors bounced open. The silence shattered. Victor Gallo did not like people. He tolerated them. He utilized them. Occasionally he disposed of them, but he did not like them. At 34, he sat at the apex of a criminal syndicate that had quietly swallowed the eastern seaboard's shipping infrastructure. He wore bespoke suits that cost more than most cars, and his face was a rigid, expressionless mask of calculated indifference. Women routinely threw themselves into his orbit, drawn to the wealth and the sharp, dangerous angles of his jaw. He slept with them when he was bored. He forgot their faces by morning. It was an efficient, sterile existence. Every Tuesday at exactly 8:14 a.m., Victor took the private access elevator from the subterranean parking garage to the 42nd floor of the Gallo Tower. He was always accompanied by Arthur, his head of security, a man built like a commercial refrigerator. The routine was sacred. Today was no different. The underground garage was damp, smelling of exhaust and wet concrete from the morning storm. Victor stepped into the brushed steel cabin. Arthur pressed the button for the top floor. The doors began their smooth, silent glide toward closure. Then came the frantic slapping of wet rubber on concrete. "Hold it, please, just don't let it shut." Victor's gaze remained fixed forward. Arthur shifted, his heavy hand instinctively brushing the lapel of his jacket, hovering over the concealed holster. Nobody yelled in the executive garage. The heavy steel doors were inches from ceiling when a scuffed, soaking wet white sneaker wedged itself into the gap. The sensors beeped in harsh protest. The mechanical gears groaned, reversed, and the doors slid wide open. She fell in rather than stepped in. She was a disaster of damp wool and static hair. A cheap umbrella, dripping muddy water onto the immaculate mahogany floor, was clamped under her arm. Both hands were occupied, one clutching a bulky, oversized tote bag that seemed to be actively spilling files, the other gripping a flimsy paper cup of coffee. She didn't look at Victor. She didn't look at Arthur. She just gasped for air, leaning against the polished handrail. "Thank God," she wheezed, her chest heaving. The L train was delayed for 40 minutes. If I'm late again, my manager is going to physically consume my soul. Arthur took a step forward, his voice a low, threatening gravel. "Ma'am, this is a restricted—" Victor raised 2 fingers, a millimeter of movement. Arthur stopped instantly, stepping back into the corner. Victor looked at the intruder. She was average. That was the first thing his clinically observant mind registered. No designer labels. Her tan trench coat was frayed at the cuffs. A smear of blue ink stained the side of her thumb. Her hair, a chaotic shade of muddy blonde, was plastered to her cheek by the rain. She lacked the aggressive, manicured polish of the women who usually found their way into his line of sight. She finally looked up, noticing the heavy, suffocating silence of the cabin. Her eyes darted from Arthur's monolithic, scowling frame to Victor. She blinked. "Oh, did I interrupt an intense stare-down?" Victor didn't answer. He just stared at her. He felt a strange, jarring sensation in the center of his chest. It wasn't attraction. It wasn't anger. It was acute, hyper-focused curiosity. She shifted uncomfortably under his deadpan gaze. "Look, I know this is the executive lift. I saw the sign. But the main lobby line is out the door, and I'm on a final warning. So if you're going to report me, can you at least do it after 9 a.m. so I get paid for today?" She took a sip of her coffee, winced, and muttered, Burned. Again. Brilliant. Victor kept his eyes on her face. What floor? His voice was low, rough from disuse, carrying the quiet authority of a man who never had to repeat himself. She swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of the tension radiating off him. 14, please. Victor reached out and pressed the glowing button for the 14th floor. The elevator climbed. The silence returned, but it had morphed. It wasn't the dead, empty vacuum Victor was used to. It hummed with her nervous energy. She smelled like cheap vanilla soap, wet pavement, and anxiety. It was messy. It was real. The digital display chimed. 14. The doors slid open to reveal a bustling, fluorescent-lit hallway. She scrambled to gather her slipping tote bag, nearly dropping the umbrella again. Thanks, she tossed over her shoulder. You're a lifesaver, literally. She scurried out, blending instantly into a sea of cubicles and ringing phones. The doors closed, sealing Victor and Arthur back in the quiet cabin. Sir, Arthur grunted, clearly agitated. Security breach. I should have management terminate her immediately. Victor watched the floor indicator climb. 15, 16. He touched the cuff of his shirt, adjusting it by a fraction of an inch. No, Victor said quietly. Her name was Harper Davis. Victor found this out at 11:30 a.m., an hour after he had finished reviewing the quarterly laundering projections from the Port Authority unions. He had called HR. He didn't explain why. When you own the building and the shadow economy beneath it, you don't explain yourself to middle management. He sat behind his massive obsidian desk, looking at her digital personnel file on his tablet. 26. Junior graphic designer for a subsidiary marketing firm his holding company had acquired 2 years ago. Salary. Painfully low. No criminal record. One write-up for insubordination. Victor locked the tablet and pushed it away. He stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the grey, rain-slicked skyline. He was losing his mind. That was the only logical conclusion. For 10 years, his survival had depended on absolute detachment. He didn't care about junior graphic designers. He cared about profit margins, loyalty, and eliminating threats before they materialized. Yet the image of that scuffed white sneaker wedging into his perfectly ordered life kept flashing behind his eyes. The next morning, at 8:10 a.m., Victor stood in the subterranean garage. Arthur was at his side. "Sir, we're early," Arthur noted. "We wait," Victor replied, his tone ending the conversation. At 8:13 a.m., the rapid squeak of rubber soles echoed off the concrete pillars. Victor felt a muscle feather in his jaw. Harper came rounding the corner, clutching a paper bag and a massive iced coffee. She froze when she saw the open elevator and the 2 men standing inside. Her shoulders slumped. "Oh, come on," she groaned, walking over. She stood just outside the doors. "You guys again? Do you just live in this specific elevator?" Arthur glared. Victor simply held his hand over the door sensor so it wouldn't close. "Get in," Victor said. Harper sighed, stepping inside. 14, please, since you're standing by the buttons." Victor pressed 14. He pressed 42. She leaned against the back wall, ripping open her paper bag. She pulled out a violently artificial-looking breakfast pastry. Flaky crust went everywhere. Arthur twitched as a crumb landed on his polished black shoe. "I woke up early today," Harper announced to the air, taking a massive bite. "Subway was on time. I was going to be 15 minutes early. Then a pigeon decided to kamikaze into the subway doors and delayed us." She looked at Victor, chewing aggressively. "You look like a guy who doesn't ride the subway or deal with pigeons." "I don't," Victor said. "Must be nice. What do you do?" "Finance. You have major foreclosing on an orphanage energy." Arthur exhaled sharply through his nose, a clear warning. Harper ignored him. "I oversee logistics," Victor said smoothly. It wasn't a lie. Moving illegal weapons was a logistical nightmare. Fun, she mumbled. She dropped a piece of icing on the floor. She cursed softly, bending down to scrape it up with a napkin. Sorry, I'm a walking hazard. You're wearing... I don't even know what that suit is made of, but it looks like it costs my annual rent. Don't let me get crumbs on you. Victor looked down at her. She was crouched by his expensive Italian leather shoes, scrubbing at the floor with a cheap napkin. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to reach down and pull her up by the shoulders. He wanted to tell her she didn't have to clean the floor for him. He wanted to tell her he could buy her the entire bakery. He kept his hands firmly at his sides. "Leave it," he ordered softly. She stood up, tossing the napkin into her bag. The elevator pinged at 14. "Well, logistics guy, see you around," she said, stepping out into the fluorescent purgatory of her office. Victor let the doors shut. He stood in silence as the elevator surged upward. "Arthur," Victor said, not turning around. "Yes, boss?" "Have the property manager install a premium espresso machine on the 14th floor." "Today?" Arthur blinked. "Sir?" "Today, Arthur. And restock their break room with fresh pastries. From the bakery on 5th. Arthur swallowed his confusion. "Understood." The docks always smelled like rust and dead fish. Tonight, they smelled like copper, too. Victor leaned over the industrial sink in the empty warehouse bathroom, running the cold water. He splashed it over his face, watching the water swirl pink down the drain. His knuckles were split, throbbing with a dull, heavy ache. The meeting with the Irish outfit had gone poorly. Negotiations broke down. Guns were drawn. Victor had handled the immediate threat with the brutal, blinding violence that had earned him his seat at the head of the table. 2 men were dead. Victor's face was bruised, and a shallow cut ran along his cheekbone where a signet ring had caught him. He dried his face with a rough paper towel. His tailored jacket was ruined, tossed in the back of his armored SUV. He was down to his white dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up over his thick forearms, exposing the dark ink of his syndicate tattoos. It was 10:45 p.m. He should go to his penthouse. He should pour a glass of scotch, let his private doctor stitch his cheek, and sleep. Instead, 30 minutes later, his SUV pulled into the subterranean garage of the Gallo Tower. He didn't bring Arthur upstairs. He took the elevator alone. He bypassed the 42nd floor. He pressed 14. He didn't know if she would be there. It was irrational. It was stupid. A man in his position did not take detours. But the violence of the night had left a cold, hollow ringing in his ears. And he found himself desperately needing to see something normal, something that didn't bleed, scheme, or lie to him. The doors opened. The 14th floor was a graveyard of dark cubicles. The only illumination came from the emergency exit signs and a single, bright square of light in the far corner. Victor walked silently across the cheap carpet. Harper was sitting at her desk. Her hair was piled into a messy bun, secured with what looked like 2 pencils. She was wearing blue light glasses, furiously clicking her mouse while muttering hostile threats to her monitor. Victor stopped 10 feet away, lingering in the shadows. He just watched her. "Stupid, rendering garbage software," she hissed, slamming a palm on her desk. She spun her chair around in frustration and froze. She gasped, her hand flying to her chest. "Jesus Christ!" Victor stepped out of the shadows, coming into the dim glow of her desk lamp. Harper blinked behind her glasses, her heart hammering visibly in her throat. She recognized the suit pants, the broad shoulders. "Logistics guy, what are you doing creeping around in the dark?" She squinted, leaning forward. The annoyance in her voice drained away, replaced by sharp alarm. "Oh my God! Your face! What happened to you?" Victor stood still. He was suddenly acutely aware of how he must look. He was a monster who had just crawled out of the dark, standing in the middle of her mundane, safe reality. "A disagreement," Victor said. His voice was gravel. Harper stood up. She didn't run. She didn't call security. She walked over to her filing cabinet, pulled open the top drawer, and took out a plastic first aid kit. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to a small swivel chair next to her desk. Victor stared at her. Nobody commanded him. Men died for raising their voices at him. He walked over and sat down. Harper dragged her own chair closer. She opened an alcohol wipe. "This is going to sting. Logistics must be a lot more aggressive than I thought." "Supply chains are highly competitive," Victor murmured. She pressed the wipe to his cheek. Victor didn't flinch, but he felt the heat of her fingers against his skin. She was so close he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. He could smell the lingering scent of that cheap vanilla soap. "You should be at home," Victor said, his eyes locked on her face. "I have a deadline," she sighed, dabbing at the cut. "My boss tossed a massive client rebrand on my desk at 4:55 p.m. and told me it needs to be on his desk by tomorrow morning. He's a parasite." Victor committed the boss's name to memory. The man would be unemployed by sunrise. "You shouldn't let people exploit you," Victor said quietly. Harper laughed, a tired, genuine sound. She tossed the bloody wipe into a bin and peeled open a bandage. "Exploitation is the price of rent in this city, man. We don't all get to wear silk ties and win fistfights over supply chains." She pressed the bandage to his cheek, smoothing the edges down with her thumb. Her hand lingered for a fraction of a second. She pulled back, clearing her throat, suddenly aware of the heavy, magnetic pull in the small space between them. "There," she said softly. "You'll live." Victor looked at her. The cold, hollow ringing in his ears was entirely gone. In its place was a terrifying, undeniable realization. He didn't just want to watch her from a distance anymore. He wanted to pull her out of this cubicle. He wanted to burn down the building if she asked him to. "Thank you, Harper," he said. Her eyes widened slightly. "I never told you my name." Victor stood up. The massive height difference forced her to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "I know," Victor said. He turned and walked away into the dark, leaving her standing there, the silence crashing back into the room behind him. The espresso machine on the 14th floor was a monolithic piece of chrome and polished steel. It looked like a spaceship that had crash-landed onto a cheap laminate countertop. Harper stood in front of it at 8:45 a.m. on Wednesday, staring at the glowing touchscreen. She hadn't slept. She had submitted the rebrand presentation at 4:12 a.m., collapsed onto her desk, and woken up at 7 a.m. with a keyboard imprint on her left cheek. She was entirely prepared to face the wrath of Richard, her perpetually red-faced, micromanaging department head. Instead, she found the spaceship coffee maker, a spread of artisan pastries that smelled like pure butter, and a strange, buzzing quiet in the office. "Did corporate buy us out?" Harper muttered, tapping a button that dispensed a perfectly layered macchiato into her mug. Her co-worker, a nervous guy named Ben, slid up next to her. He grabbed a chocolate croissant with the reverence of a man handling a holy relic. "You didn't hear," he whispered, his eyes darting toward the glass-walled manager's office. "Hear what?" "I was technically unconscious for the last 3 hours. Richard is gone." Harper took a sip of the coffee. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. Gone like he went to a dental appointment, or gone like he threw another tantrum and broke the copier. Gone like his office is entirely empty. Security came up at 6 in the morning with cardboard boxes. They packed his desk. HR sent an email 5 minutes ago saying Richard has decided to pursue alternative career paths effective immediately, and that we're now directly under the holding company's oversight. Ben took a bite of the croissant, a look of pure bliss washing over his face. And then this machine showed up. It's like we died and went to corporate heaven. Harper stared at Richard's dark, empty office. A chill, completely unrelated to the aggressive air conditioning, walked up the back of her neck. You shouldn't let people exploit you. The memory of the logistics guy sitting in her cheap swivel chair, his face bruised, his voice carrying the weight of a loaded gun, echoed in her head. She shook it off. It was a coincidence. The logistics guy was a mid-level suit with a temper and a nice jacket. He didn't have the power to disappear a department head before sunrise. Did he? 42 floors above, Victor watched the 14th floor break room on a muted security feed. He sat in the dark leather chair behind his desk, his elbows resting on the arms, his hands steepled in front of his face. He watched her drink the coffee. He watched the tension leave her shoulders. He watched her pick up a pastry, examine it, and take a massive, ungraceful bite. A faint, almost imperceptible line of tension eased in Victor's chest. Arthur stood by the door, rigid and entirely out of his element. "Sir, the transition of the marketing department is complete." Richard was given a severance package and signed a very aggressive non-disclosure agreement. He is relocating to Seattle. Today. "Good," Victor murmured, his eyes never leaving the screen. "Sir," Arthur started, hesitating. This was dangerous territory. You did not question Victor Gallo. "If I may, the syndicate captains from the docks are requesting a follow-up meeting after last night's complications. They want reassurance." "They'll get it when I decide to give it to them," Victor said. The ice was back in his voice. "Let them sweat." The Irish made a move. We repelled it. They need to know I am perfectly comfortable letting them bleed a little longer. "Understood." Arthur shifted his weight. "And the girl, boss?" Victor finally pulled his gaze away from the monitor. He looked at Arthur. The silence in the room grew heavy, suffocating, pressing against the glass windows. Arthur swallowed hard, regretting the question instantly. "Harper," Victor corrected softly. "Her name is Harper." "Yes, boss, Harper. Is she a liability?" "She is none of your concern, Arthur." It was a dismissal. Arthur nodded once and stepped out of the office, closing the heavy oak doors behind him. Left alone, Victor stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city sprawled below him, a concrete grid of millions of people living millions of insignificant lives. For 10 years, he had operated above it all. He had built a fortress of money, fear, and blood. He was safe up here. He was untouchable. But looking down at the grey streets, he realized he didn't want to be in the fortress anymore. He wanted to be on the subway. He wanted to smell cheap vanilla soap. He wanted to feel the rough scrape of a paper towel against his skin. He needed to see her again. It was a dangerous impulse. He was a dangerous man, and his proximity brought nothing but violence. He knew this. The logical, ruthless part of his brain told him to lock down the 14th floor, sever the subsidiary, and never ride the executive elevator at 8:14 a.m. again. Victor checked his heavy steel watch. It was 5 p.m. He grabbed his coat. Down in the lobby, the evening rush hour was in full swing. A river of exhausted corporate workers flowed toward the revolving doors, desperate to escape into the rainy evening. Harper was among them, her oversized tote bag slung over her shoulder, her frayed trench coat buttoned to her chin. She was wrestling with her cheap umbrella, trying to force the metal prongs open as she walked. "Come on, you piece of garbage," she muttered, shaking the umbrella. It snapped backward, turning entirely inside out. Harper stopped in the middle of the crowded lobby, staring at the ruined umbrella with a look of profound defeat. She sighed, letting her head drop. "Perfect. Just perfect. You need a new umbrella." The voice was low, rough, and intimately close. Harper jumped, spinning around. Victor was standing less than 2 feet away. He was wearing a dark charcoal overcoat that made his shoulders look impossibly broad. The bruise on his cheek had blossomed into a dark, angry purple, and the white bandage was stark against his tan skin. People in the lobby were actively parting around him, giving him a wide berth without even realizing they were doing it. "Logistics guy," Harper breathed. Her heart gave a strange, erratic thump against her ribs. She looked at his face, feeling an entirely inappropriate urge to reach up and check if the bandage was still secure. "Are you stalking me?" "No," Victor said. He looked at the ruined umbrella in her hand. He reached out and smoothly took it from her grip. He walked 2 steps to a heavy brass trash can and dropped it inside. He walked back to her. "I'm leaving. You require transport." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Harper blinked. "I require the L train, which is currently flooded, according to Twitter. So I require the bus. You don't have to ferry me around just because I gave you a Band-Aid, man. I have a car waiting. Tell me where you live." "Are you serious? You're acting like a mob boss trying to kidnap a witness." She laughed, a nervous, airy sound. Victor didn't smile. He just stared at her. The deadpan intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. He stepped closer, invading her personal space. The scent of rain, expensive cedar, and something uniquely dark wrapped around her. "I am offering you a ride, Harper," he said quietly. "It is raining. You do not have an umbrella, and I do not like the idea of you standing on a street corner." She stared up at him. She knew she should say no. She knew this man was strange, intense, and physically dangerous. But looking into his eyes, she didn't feel fear. She felt something entirely different, a heavy magnetic pull, a strange sense of being completely, entirely seen by a man who looked at the rest of the world like it didn't exist. "Fine," Harper relented, shivering as a draft from the revolving doors hit her. "But if you murder me, I'm going to haunt your logistics department forever." "Noted," Victor said. He raised a hand, gesturing toward the doors. "After you." The car was not a normal car. Harper sat in the back of the black Maybach, sinking into leather seats that felt softer than her mattress. The windows were heavily tinted. A solid partition separated them from the driver. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, blocking out the chaotic honking and sirens of the city outside. Victor sat next to her, staring straight ahead. He took up an enormous amount of space. "So," Harper said, breaking the silence. She couldn't handle the quiet. It made her hyper-aware of the space between them. "Richard was fired today. Erased from existence, actually." "I'm aware," Victor said. "Right. Corporate logistics." Harper twisted the strap of her tote bag. "They replaced our coffee machine too. It makes flat whites." Ben cried. "Adequate caffeine increases productivity." Harper turned her head to look at him. His profile was sharp, cut from granite. "Did you have something to do with it?" "The Richard thing." Victor slowly turned his head to meet her gaze. He could lie. It would be easy. He lied to politicians, judges, and killers every day. But looking at Harper, the words stuck in his throat. He didn't want to bring his shadows into her light, but he refused to insult her intelligence. "Your manager was an obstacle to a healthy working environment," Victor said evenly. "Obstacles are meant to be removed." Harper's eyes widened slightly. She stared at him, trying to pass the corporate speak from the underlying threat. "You fired him because I complained about my deadline." "I relocated him," Victor corrected. "He was generously compensated." You can't just do that. You can't just upend a man's life because a girl in an elevator complained about him." "I can," Victor said softly. "And I did." Harper fell silent. She looked away, staring out the rain-streaked window. She didn't know what to make of him. He was a puzzle with jagged, dangerous edges. The car glided out of the polished financial district and entered the grittier, neglected streets of her neighborhood. The neon signs flickered. Trash piled up on the curbs. Harper felt a sudden spike of embarrassment. She lived in a crumbling walk-up above a closed-down laundromat. It was not the kind of place a man in a Maybach ever visited. "You can just pull over here," Harper said, gesturing to the corner. "It's a one-way street up ahead." Victor didn't relay the order to the driver. The car smoothly turned down the narrow street, tires splashing through deep potholes, until it idled directly in front of her building. "Thank you for the ride," Harper said, grabbing her bag. She reached for the door handle. "Wait," Victor commanded. He didn't wait for her response. He opened his door and stepped out into the pouring rain. Harper watched in confusion as he walked around the back of the car. He opened her door, holding a massive black umbrella over the opening to shield her. She stepped out, immediately huddled under the protective dome of the umbrella. He was standing very close. "You're getting your suit wet," she noted, looking at the rain, spotting his shoulders. "It's just fabric." They stood on the cracked sidewalk. Harper pointed to the heavy metal door covered in graffiti. "Well, this is my glamorous estate. Thanks again, Mr. Logistics." She reached into her bag, digging for her keys. As she did, the metal door violently swung open. A large, heavy-set man in a dirty undershirt stumbled out. He smelled intensely of stale beer and cheap cigars. It was Mr. Henderson, the building owner, who had a reputation for aggressive rent collection and entering apartments without notice. He glared at Harper. "Davis, you're late on the utilities fee. I told you, I want the $50 by Friday or I'm shutting off your hot water." Harper stiffened, her face flushing red. "Mr. Henderson, the lease says utilities are included. You can't just make up fees because you lost at the track again." Henderson stepped forward, his face turning an ugly shade of purple. He raised a thick, meaty finger, shoving it aggressively toward Harper's face. "Listen here, you little—" He never finished the sentence. Victor moved with a terrifying, fluid speed. His large hand shot out, clamping around Henderson's thick wrist. He didn't just hold it, he applied a precise, localized pressure. Henderson let out a sharp gasp of pain, his knees buckling slightly as the bones in his wrist ground together under Victor's iron grip. Victor stepped smoothly between Harper and the landlord. His face didn't change. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely hollowed out, empty of any human emotion. The umbrella shielded them, creating an intimate, terrifying bubble on the wet sidewalk. "You are addressing her incorrectly," Victor whispered. His voice was barely louder than the falling rain, but it carried a lethal, freezing weight. Henderson's eyes bulged in panic. He looked at the tailored suit, the scarred knuckles, the black Maybach idling on the curb, and the dead, terrifying eyes of the man breaking his wrist. The landlord instantly recognized what he was looking at. "You didn't live in this city without knowing the look of a man who killed without consequence." I, Henderson stammered, sweat breaking out on his forehead despite the cold rain. "The hot water will remain operational," Victor stated, his voice flat. "There are no additional fees. If she ever feels uncomfortable in this building again, I will return, and we will have a much longer conversation. Do you understand the mechanics of this arrangement?" Yes, I got it. Jesus, let go." Victor released him. He didn't shove him, he just opened his hand. Henderson stumbled backward, clutching his wrist, and practically fell back inside the building, slamming the heavy metal door shut behind him. The silence returned to the street, save for the steady drumming of the rain against the umbrella. Harper stood frozen. Her heart was beating so fast it blurred in her chest. She looked at Victor. He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket, methodically wiping the hand that had grabbed the landlord before dropping the cloth into a nearby puddle. He turned to look at her. The lethal emptiness was gone from his eyes. replaced by that intense, hyper-focused observation. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. Harper swallowed hard. "Who are you?" "I'm the man who makes sure you have hot water," Victor said. "You almost broke his wrist. You didn't even blink." She stepped back, out from under the umbrella, letting the rain hit her face. "You aren't in corporate logistics. Richard didn't relocate, did he?" "Richard is alive and in Seattle," Victor said firmly, stepping forward to cover her with the umbrella again. "I do not kill civilians." The word hung in the air. Civilians. Harper's breath hitched. She looked at the expensive car. She looked at the bruises on his face. She looked at the way he stood, balanced, completely unaffected by the chaos of the city. "What are you?" she whispered. "I am a man who has lived a very dark life, Harper," Victor said, his voice dropping to a gravelly murmur. "I am a man who likes things quiet. I like things orderly." He looked down at her, his dark eyes tracing the line of her jaw, the wet strands of her hair. "And then you stopped my elevator." Harper felt a shiver run down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. "Go inside," Victor commanded gently. "Lock your door." He turned and walked back to the car. Harper stood in the rain, watching the red taillights fade into the mist, her chest tight with a terrifying, thrilling realization. She had just been claimed by a monster, and God help her, she didn't want to run. The internet is a dangerous place when you know exactly what questions to ask. Harper sat on the floor of her apartment, wrapped in a blanket, a mug of cheap tea growing cold on the floorboards beside her. The radiator clanked uselessly in the corner. Her laptop screen cast a harsh blue light over her face. It was 2 a.m. She had started by searching the holding company that owned her subsidiary. Gallo Enterprises, a sterile corporate website, vague descriptions of shipping, real estate, and imports. Then she dug deeper. She searched court records, union disputes at the Eastern Seaboard docks, FBI press releases regarding organized crime in the shipping sector. The name appeared only in the shadows of the articles, whispered in the margins of indictments that never quite stuck. Victor Gallo, the head of the Gallo Syndicate, suspected of racketeering, extortion, and controlling the underground arms trade disguised as logistical freight. Untouchable, ruthless, the ghost of the Eastern Seaboard. Harper stared at a grainy surveillance photo buried in a 10-year-old news archive. It was him, younger but the same brutal jawline, the same dead, terrifying eyes. She slammed the laptop shut. The sharp crack echoed in her small apartment. She pulled her knees to her chest, resting her chin on them. She was a junior graphic designer. She stressed about hex codes and font alignments. The most illegal thing she had ever done was use her roommate's Netflix password after they moved out. She had just let a Mafia boss fix her coffee machine and threaten her landlord. Fear was the logical response. She should pack a bag, break her lease, and move back to Ohio. She should vanish. But as she sat in the quiet dark, all she could think about was the way he had held the umbrella, the way he let her put a cheap Band-Aid on his face, the way his voice sounded when he said her name. "I do not like the idea of you standing on a street corner." At 8 a.m. the next morning, Harper walked into the lobby of the Gallo Tower. She didn't get in line for the main elevators. She didn't look at her phone. She walked straight past the front desk, ignoring the security guards, and headed down the marble corridor toward the private executive lift. Arthur was standing by the polished steel doors. He saw her coming. He straightened up, his massive frame blocking the call button. "Miss Davis," Arthur grunted. "You are not authorized to be in this corridor." Harper stopped 2 feet away from him. She felt entirely out of her depth, a mouse challenging a grizzly bear. But she tilted her chin up. "I want to see him," she said. Her voice trembled slightly, but she held her ground. Arthur's face remained a mask of stone. "Mr. Gallo is unavailable. Tell him I'm here." Tell him the girl from the 14th floor wants to talk about logistics. Arthur stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He reached up, pressing a finger to the earpiece hidden in his ear. He spoke softly, shielding his mouth. He waited. He listened. Arthur dropped his hand. He stepped aside, his face grim. He will see you. Do not test his patience, Miss Davis. He is not a man who tolerates games. Neither am I, Harper muttered. Arthur pressed a keycard to the scanner. The heavy steel doors slid open. Harper stepped inside. She pressed 42. The ride was agonizingly slow. Her stomach twisted into a tight knot. The digital numbers ticked upward, pulling her out of her normal world and launching her into his. 42. The doors chimed and parted. The top floor was a fortress of glass, black marble, and dark wood. It was entirely silent. Harper stepped onto the plush carpet, her wet sneakers leaving faint marks on the pristine floor. Keep walking straight. The voice came from a speaker above her, rough, commanding. She walked down the hallway, passing massive double doors that stood open. She entered his office. It was the size of her entire apartment building. One wall was entirely glass, overlooking the city shrouded in morning fog. Victor was standing by the window. He wasn't wearing a jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. The sleeves rolled up to expose the dark, violent ink crawling up his forearms. He looked dangerous. He looked exactly like the man she had read about in the archives. He turned around slowly, his dark eyes locked onto hers. You researched me, Victor stated. It wasn't a question. You own the city's docks. You run a criminal syndicate. You're Victor Gallo. Harper's voice was remarkably steady, though her hands were shaking. She shoved them deep into the pockets of her frayed trench coat. Yes. He didn't flinch. He didn't try to soften the blow. Are you going to kill me for knowing? Victor's jaw tightened. A flash of something raw and deeply pained crossed his stoic features. He took a step toward her, the sheer gravity of his presence pulling the air out of the room. I would burn this city to ash before I let anyone harm you, Victor said, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating hum. Including myself. Harper held her breath. Why? You don't know me. You're a mob boss, Victor. You extort people. You hurt people. I eliminate threats, Victor corrected softly, closing the distance between them. He stopped just inches away. She had to tilt her head back to look at him. I live in the dark, Harper. For 10 years, I have not felt a single human emotion. I operated. I survived. I built an empire on violence because violence is the only currency this world respects. He reached up slowly, telegraphing his movement so she wouldn't flinch. He didn't touch her. His hand hovered just an inch from her cheek, tracing the line of her jaw in the air. And then, he whispered, his eyes dropping to her lips before meeting her eyes again. A girl shoved a wet sneaker into my elevator. She complained about her boss. She dropped pastry crumbs on my shoes. She didn't look at me with fear or greed. She looked at me like I was a person. Harper's heart hammered against her ribs. She could feel the heat radiating off him. She could smell the gun oil and expensive cologne clinging to his shirt. You're a criminal, she whispered. A final, desperate attempt to hold on to her rational mind. I am. You threatened my landlord. I protected what is mine, Harper gasped softly. I'm not yours. Victor finally closed the gap. His large, rough hand cupped her jaw. His touch was impossibly gentle, a stark contrast to the violence she knew he was capable of. His thumb brushed over her cheekbone. You are, Victor said, his voice a dark, absolute vow. You were mine the second the elevator doors opened. You just don't know it yet. He didn't kiss her. He didn't force her. He just stood there, letting the weight of his confession settle over her, leaving the choice entirely in her hands. She could walk out the door, take the elevator down, and disappear into the crowd. He would let her go. He would suffer the silence again if that was what she wanted. Harper looked into the eyes of the monster. She saw the blood on his hands and the ice in his veins. But beneath it all, she saw the desperate human need of a man standing in the cold, waiting to be let in. Harper reached up. She wrapped her fingers around his wrist. She didn't push him away. She pulled him closer. When she pulled him in, Victor didn't move immediately. For a fraction of a second, the deadliest man on the eastern seaboard froze. He was a man accustomed to taking, breaking, and commanding. Being invited, being chosen, shattered the rigid architecture of his mind. Then his control snapped. His mouth came down on hers. It wasn't a gentle, cinematic kiss. It was desperate, heavy. It tasted like black coffee, adrenaline, and ruin. Victor's hands, massive and calloused, framed her face like she was made of antique glass, holding her with a careful, terrifying reverence. Harper gripped the lapels of his shirt, anchoring herself against the sheer force of him. She felt the solid, unyielding muscle of his chest, the heavy thud of his heart, and the cold, dense shape of the holstered weapon sitting flat against his ribs. It should have terrified her. The gun, the man, the reality of what she was doing. Instead, she leaned into it. She felt the chaotic, buzzing anxiety of her daily life evaporate, swallowed whole by the overwhelming, absolute safety of his shadow. When Victor finally pulled away, his breathing was ragged. He rested his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed. He looked entirely wrecked, stripped of the bulletproof armor he wore for the rest of the world. "You can't walk back from this," Victor whispered, his voice a gravelly rasp. "If you stay in this room, Harper, you are mine. I will not let you go. I will tear apart anyone who tries to take you." "I'm not asking to leave," she said softly. She brushed a stray piece of dark hair from his forehead. Victor opened his eyes. The terrifying deadpan void was gone. In its place was a fierce, possessive fire that made her breath hitch. Life on the 14th floor changed subtly over the next 3 weeks. Harper still went to her cubicle. She still designed logos. She still dealt with clients who didn't know what they wanted. But the edges of her world had been padded with Kevlar. The subsidiary was quietly restructured. The new department head was a quiet, polite woman who never asked Harper to stay past 5 p.m. A dedicated town car was permanently stationed outside the building, its driver waiting strictly for Harper at the end of her shift. She didn't ride the L train anymore. She didn't worry about her landlord, who now actively crossed the street whenever he saw her coming. And every Tuesday, at 8:14 a.m., she took the executive elevator. She would step in, and Arthur would press the button for 42. She would spend exactly 15 minutes in Victor's office. Sometimes they drank coffee in silence. Sometimes she sat on his desk, swinging her legs, talking about her mundane complaints, while he reviewed shipping manifests worth tens of millions of dollars. He listened to her with the same hyper-focused intensity he applied to dismantling rival cartels. She grounded him. She was the only quiet place in his violent universe. But Victor's universe did not tolerate quiet for long. A syndicate operates on fear and perceived invulnerability. The Irish faction, led by an aging, bitter man named Declan, had not forgotten the 2 men Victor had killed at the docks. They had spent the last month looking for a crack in the armor of the Gallo Empire. Victor was famously a ghost. He had no family, he had no vices, he had no weaknesses, until Declan's men noticed the black Maybach idling outside a crumbling walk-up in the worst part of town. It was a Thursday evening. The rain had washed the city slick and black. Harper was working late, ignoring the polite suggestions of her new manager to go home. She had a project she actually cared about, and she wanted it finished. She was alone on the 14th floor. The only sound was the hum of the fluorescent lights and the clicking of her mouse. 42 floors above, Victor was sitting at his desk. He was looking at a live feed of the security cameras. He watched her work. It was a habit he had developed, a silent vigil that kept the hollow ringing out of his ears. His desk phone buzzed. A direct line, secure. "Speak," Victor commanded. "Boss." It was Arthur. He was stationed in the lobby. "We have a problem. 3 vehicles just pulled up to the loading dock, unmarked, heavy suspension. I recognize the driver of the lead car. It's Sullivan, Declan's right hand." Victor stood up. The heavy leather chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. "Lock down the lobby." Victor's voice was a flat, lethal monotone. "Kill the power to the main elevators." "Sir, they aren't coming for the lobby. They bypassed the security gate. They're heading for the service stairs." Arthur paused, the realization hitting him. "They're moving toward the mid-levels." Victor didn't reply. He dropped the phone. He reached under his desk, his hand wrapping around the cold, textured grip of his Sig Sauer. He racked the slide. The sharp, metallic clack echoed in the silent office. He didn't take the elevator. It was too slow. Victor threw open the heavy oak doors and broke into a sprint toward the executive stairwell. On the 14th floor, Harper stretched her arms over her head, her joints popping. She checked the time on her monitor. 8:45 p.m. She sighed, saving her file and shutting down her computer. The office plunged into dim, standby lighting. She grabbed her oversized tote bag and slung it over her shoulder. She walked towards the glass doors leading to the main hallway. She stopped. The heavy, reinforced fire door at the end of the corridor, the one leading to the service stairs, was supposed to be locked. It was standing open, a wedge of wood jammed under the frame. Harper felt a sudden, icy drop in her stomach. The silence of the office suddenly felt heavy, predatory. She took a step backward. 3 men stepped out of the stairwell. They weren't wearing suits. They wore dark tactical jackets, their faces obscured by the shadows of the dim hallway. The man in the center, Sullivan, was massive, holding a suppressed automatic pistol down by his side. He looked down the corridor. He saw her standing by the glass doors. Sullivan smiled. It was a cold, ugly thing. "Well," Sullivan said, his voice carrying down the empty hall. "Look what the ghost left out in the open." Harper didn't scream. She didn't ask questions. She turned and ran. She scrambled frantically through the maze of cubicles. Her chest burned as panic flooded her system. She knocked over a chair, the plastic clattering violently against the cheap carpet. She needed a weapon. She needed a phone. Her cell was at the bottom of her massive tote bag. "Don't run, sweetheart," Sullivan's voice floated over the low partition walls, calm and amused. The heavy thud of their boots followed her. "We don't want to hurt you. We just want to use your phone to make a call to your boyfriend." Harper ducked under a desk in the center aisle, pressing her back against the metal filing cabinet. She clamped a hand over her mouth to muffle the sound of her own ragged breathing. Her hands were shaking violently. She dug into her bag, her fingers desperately searching for the smooth glass of her phone screen. Clink. One of the men kicked a trash can near her aisle. They were spreading out. "Check the break room," Sullivan ordered. Harper found her phone. She pulled it out, her thumb hovering over the screen. The brightness was blinding in the dark under the desk. Before she could dial, a heavy boot slammed into the side of the desk she was hiding under. The wooden top splintered, the entire structure shoving hard against her shoulder. She gasped, dropping the phone. A large hand reached down, grabbing the collar of her trench coat. She was hauled out from under the desk, effortlessly, thrown backward onto the open floor of the main aisle. She hit the carpet hard. The wind knocked out of her lungs. Sullivan stood over her, aiming the suppressed pistol directly at her chest. "Get up," Sullivan grunted. Harper scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the rough carpet. She looked up at the barrel of the gun. She thought of Victor. She thought of the cold, safe shadow she had willingly stepped into. She realized, with a sudden crystal clarity, that this was the price. "You're making a mistake," Harper choked out. "The only mistake was Gallo thinking he could step on our necks and not get bitten," Sullivan sneered. He reached down, grabbing her arm and hauling her to her feet. "Walk." The ping of the elevator chime cut through the air. Sullivan froze. The other two men spun around, raising their weapons toward the main lobby doors. The digital display above the executive elevator flashed. 14. The heavy steel doors didn't just slide open. They practically blew apart, groaning under the violent force of a man who didn't have time for mechanics. Victor stepped out. He didn't look like the corporate executive Harper knew. His suit jacket was gone. His white shirt was stark against the dim lighting. His face was entirely devoid of humanity. It was the face of a man who had left the civilized world behind and returned to the slaughterhouse. "Gallo," Sullivan barked, shoving Harper forward slightly as a shield. "Drop the gun, or I put a hole in her right now." Victor didn't stop walking. His pace was measured, steady, entirely unflinching. He raised his Sig Sauer. "I will kill everything in this room." Victor's voice was a low, terrifying rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "If you breathe on her." The two men flanking Sullivan fired. The suppressed shots were quiet, sharp thwips in the air. Drywall exploded behind Victor. He didn't even flinch. He didn't dive for cover. He simply returned fire. The violence was not cinematic. It was brutal, efficient, and horrifyingly fast. Victor double-tapped the man on the left. Two hollow points hit the man's chest, dropping him to the floor like a sack of wet cement. The man on the right managed to squeeze off another round before Victor's third shot caught him in the throat. The man collapsed, gurgling, clawing at his own neck. It took less than 3 seconds. 2 men were dead. Sullivan panicked. He shoved Harper hard to the left, throwing her into a row of filing cabinets to clear his line of sight, and raised his gun toward Victor. Victor fired. The bullet shattered Sullivan's wrist, the one holding the gun. Sullivan screamed, a high, reedy sound of absolute agony, dropping the weapon. Victor closed the distance. He didn't use the gun again. He holstered it. He wanted to use his hands. He grabbed Sullivan by the throat, driving the massive Irishman backward until he hit a concrete support pillar. The sickening crack of Sullivan's skull against the concrete echoed in the room. Victor didn't stop. He drove his fist into Sullivan's ribs, a rapid, devastating succession of blows that shattered bone and ruptured organs. "Victor!" Harper's voice was a ragged scream. Victor froze, his fist pulled back for another strike. Sullivan was entirely limp, barely breathing, sliding down the concrete pillar to crumple on the floor. Victor stood there, his chest heaving, his knuckles split and bleeding. He looked down at his own hands, the violent red staining his pale skin. He slowly turned his head to look at Harper. She was sitting on the floor, clutching her shoulder where she had hit the cabinets. She was staring at the bodies, the blood pooling on the cheap office carpet. The absolute carnage he had just brought into her world. The rage drained out of Victor, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. He had shown her the monster. He had let the dark slip off its leash in front of her. She would run now. He knew she would. He would have to let her go. He took a step backward, putting distance between them, lowering his head like a condemned man waiting for the executioner. "I'm sorry," Victor rasped. The words were heavy, thick with a 10-year-old grief he had never allowed himself to feel. "I will have Arthur escort you home." They will not come for you again. I will erase them." He turned away from her, walking toward the shadows. "Victor." He stopped. He couldn't bear to look at her. He couldn't bear to see the terror in her eyes. "Victor, look at me." He slowly turned back. Harper was standing up. She was shaking. Her face was pale and she was clutching her arm. But she wasn't running toward the stairs. She wasn't backing away. She was walking toward him, stepping over the broken glass and the debris of his violence. She stopped directly in front of him. She reached out, her small, trembling hands taking his massive, bloodied ones. "You're bleeding," she whispered. Victor stared at her, his mind struggling to process the reality of the moment. "Harper, I killed them. I killed them in front of you. They were going to kill me," she said, her voice stabilizing, finding its anchor in him. She looked up into his eyes, her gaze entirely clear. "You didn't bring the dark to me, Victor. You stood between me and it." Victor exhaled, a shaky, fractured breath. He dropped his forehead to her shoulder, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her against his chest, as if she were the only solid thing left in a collapsing universe. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the cheap vanilla soap and the smell of gunpowder. "You're safe," he murmured against her skin. "I've got you. I've got you." The penthouse was a fortress suspended in the clouds. It was 2 a.m. The city below was a sprawling grid of orange lights, oblivious to the blood spilled in a 14th floor marketing office. Harper sat on the edge of the massive marble bathtub in Victor's master suite. The bathroom was the size of her entire apartment, entirely white and sterile. Victor sat on a low stool in front of her. His shirt was discarded in the corner, ruined. His chest and arms were a canvas of dark tattoos, old scars, and fresh bruises. A bullet from the second man's gun had grazed his ribcage. It wasn't deep, but it bled heavily. Harper held a warm, damp towel, pressing it gently against his ribs. The water in the marble basin next to her was turning a pale, watery pink. The silence between them wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of the elevator. It was exhausted. It was intimate. "Arthur is handling the cleanup," Victor said quietly, staring at the floor. "The police will not be involved. The building's security footage has been wiped. Declan will be dead by sunrise. His entire network will be dismantled by my lieutenants." He spoke of dismantling an empire the way a normal man spoke of taking out the trash. "Okay," Harper said softly. She wiped away the last of the blood, picking up a butterfly bandage from the first aid kit Arthur had left them. She leaned forward, carefully applying it over the laceration on his ribs. Her fingers brushed against his skin, warm and steady. Victor finally looked up. He studied her face. The shock had worn off, leaving behind a profound, quiet strength he hadn't fully realized she possessed. "You aren't afraid of me," he stated, still trying to understand it. "I was," Harper admitted, her eyes meeting his. "When I first researched you, I was terrified. But then I realized something. You didn't hide who you were. You didn't lie to me. You just opened the door and let me decide." She smoothed the edge of the bandage down with her thumb, a mirror of the night she had patched his face in her cubicle. "I'm not a civilian anymore, Victor," she said, her voice dropping to a quiet, absolute certainty. "I know that. I accept it." Victor reached up, his large hand cupping the side of her neck, his thumb tracing her jawline. The violence, the cold, the machinery of his criminal empire. It all faded into background noise when he touched her. "You are my only humanity," Victor whispered. "Without you, I am just the ghost they write about." Harper leaned into his hand. She kissed his palm. "Then you better make sure I don't get fired for missing my shift tomorrow." A faint, rusty sound escaped Victor's chest. It took her a second to realize it was a laugh. It was a beautiful, entirely human sound. He pulled her forward, wrapping his arms around her waist, burying his face in her stomach. Harper ran her fingers through his dark hair, holding him as the adrenaline finally crashed, leaving them both anchored in the quiet dark. 6 months later, Tuesday morning, 8:14 a.m., the subterranean garage of the Gallo Tower smelled of expensive exhaust and damp concrete. Arthur stood by the private executive elevator, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He pressed the call button. The polished steel doors slid open. Victor stepped inside. He was wearing a dark, bespoke suit, looking every bit the apex predator of the city. He turned and faced the doors, his expression unreadable, his presence demanding absolute silence. The doors began to slide shut. The rapid slapping of rubber soles echoed across the garage. "Hold it, I'm coming!" Arthur didn't reach for his gun. He simply smiled, a rare, faint expression on his monolithic face. Victor raised his hand, placing it casually over the door sensor. The doors bounced open. Harper practically fell into the elevator. She was wearing a tailored beige trench coat, holding a massive iced coffee in one hand and a sleek leather briefcase in the other. Her hair was pulled back into a neat, professional clip. She leaned against the handrail, panting. "The L train is officially my nemesis. I'm going to buy the transit authority and fire everyone." Arthur chuckled softly. "Good morning, Miss Davis." "Morning, Arthur," she gasped, taking a sip of her coffee. She turned to look at Victor. The cold, deadpan mask he wore for the world instantly dissolved. The corners of his eyes softened. He reached out, taking the heavy briefcase from her hand so she wouldn't have to hold it. "You could take the car," Victor reminded her, his voice a low, warm hum that filled the small cabin. "The car takes too long in traffic. The subway keeps me humble," she retorted, stepping closer to him. She reached up, straightening his silk tie. "Besides, I like rushing to the elevator. It's nostalgic." Victor looked down at her, his eyes dark and entirely consumed by her. He wrapped a heavy arm around her waist, pulling her flush against his side. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. 42, Arthur," Victor commanded softly. Arthur pressed the button. The digital display chimed. The heavy steel doors slid shut, sealing the three of them in the cabin. The elevator surged upward. For 10 years, Victor had walked inside a heavy, cold silence. He had been untouchable. He had been alone. But as he stood there, feeling the warmth of her pressed against his side, listening to her complain about the subway and the weather, he realized the silence was gone forever. He didn't miss it at all. If Victor and Harper's intense, protective romance kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button right now. Let me know in the comments, would you have stayed after seeing Victor's dark side, or would you have run for the stairs? Don't forget to share this story with anyone who loves a gritty, slow-burn mafia romance, and subscribe to the channel for more original, dark drama stories every week. Stay safe out there, and see you in the next video.